Thank you, Wan Firza. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Yeo Min Hui. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Chinese Studies at the Nanyang Technological University. She has co-edited a pictorial biography on the Queen of Amoy dialect cinema, Chong Sit Fong. Her first monograph, Amoy Dialect Cinema and Dialect Identity Transformations in Singapore and Malaya, 1948 till 1966, was published 2020 under the Singapore Centre for Chinese Studies and SUSS AGIS. Dr. Yeo will share with us on building a multilingual film culture, the Shaw Brothers in Singapore. Let us welcome Dr. Yeo.
Thank you very much. Let me first share my screen with everyone. Yes, and my book was published with SUSS, so it's a very good kind of opportunity here to be back again at SUSS to give this talk on multilingual film culture. Once again, thank you for the very kind invite. Today I'll be speaking on multilingual cinema in Singapore. So when we talk about multilingual cinema in Singapore today, most of the time we might think about contemporary films in which we hear many different languages within a single film. And most of the time that takes the form of Singlish, right? But in my own research work on Singapore and Malaya's film histories, it dawned upon me that multilingualism actually took quite a different form in our film landscape in the early days. So just a bit of a background. I work primarily on Hokkien, which in more academic jargon, it's called Amoy Dialect Cinema. So I work primarily on Amoy Dialect Cinema, Mandarin, and Malay film histories, right? And in the course of my research work, I have to scan through lots of print materials, right? That includes film magazines, newspapers, and publicity pamphlets and flyers, etc. And over the years, I realized that while producing multilingual films were not yet common in the early days, and by early I mean around the 1940s post-war to around the 1960s, and while producing this kind of multilingual films were not yet common, a notable exception being this film, A Wish Comes True, 1965, which included a host of Chinese dialects. As you can see there on the left, it's printed in Chinese, a host of Chinese dialects with Malay language. But this was an exception at that time, right? Multilingual films produced this way were not that common. Yet, language differences, I realized, right, were bridged, or attempts were being made to bridge language differences and to respond to the multilingual reality of the Singaporean and Malayan societies through other film-related platforms and activities. In other words, perhaps when we talk about multilingualism in Singapore and Malayan cinema with a historical perspective, it is crucial to also take into account what happened off screen, right? If we want to investigate the beginnings of this phenomenon itself. And as with all history work, personally, I believe, that understanding how things were done in the past also enables us to reflect and examine our present situation, hopefully with a new set of eyes or a set of renewed eyes, right? And therefore, with this in mind, when I was thinking about how to approach this topic of film and language, I thought this could be a good chance to finally, organize my thoughts about this, to finally re-examine the materials that I've seen through the lens of language itself. So I'll be sharing with you today my preliminary observations on how the Shaw Brothers facilitated a multilingual film culture in the early days of cinema in Singapore and Malaya. This focus on the Shaw Brothers is motivated by the fact that compared to other film companies that operated in Singapore and Malaya at that time, the Shaw Brothers had a visibly much more extensive reach across different kinds of cinemas as defined by language. Right, so the Shaw Brothers company at that time, they produced, distributed, exhibited films in Mandarin and various different Chinese dialects, including Cantonese, Hokkien or Amoy dialect, Teochew, as well as films in the Malay language, in different Indian languages, English language films from Hollywood, the UK, and other places as well, Japanese, Korean, Thai, etc. Right, which was not a very common practice at that time when production and distribution companies in particular tended to focus on maybe one or two or three specific languages in their operations, right? So on this note, researchers like Yong Sai-shing and Yap So-yi have variously examined this aspect of the Shaw's enterprise, shedding light on the many different kinds of interrelated multilingual businesses that the Shaws were involved in. Right? For example, Prof. Yong talks about the entertainment culture that goes beyond film that the Shaws had in the 30s to the 60s in Singapore and Malaya that was pretty much multicultural and multilingual in nature. As well as Yap So-yi, who has done great research on the role of Chua Boon-hin as a translingual agent in the Shaw's enterprise. So Chua Boon-hin actually wrote scripts for Malay films as well as Mandarin films at that time, and then he also edited Malay film magazines and Chinese film magazines for Shaw Brothers. So he was pretty much a translingual agent, and these two scholars have done great work in establishing these histories. So building up upon their work, today I'll be sharing 3 language-related operations that, in my opinion, were 3 of Shaw's key strategies in building and sustaining a multilingual film culture. Right, so these 3 strategies, I call it translation, and then insertion, multiplication, and lastly, I will talk about specialization or compartmentalization. So first up, and maybe most obviously, what I find immediately striking when I go back to scan through these materials that I've seen would be the amount of resources and labor that were being put into the work of translation by the Shaw Brothers. So for example, we see here, this indication that there will be both English and Chinese subtitles in this Mandarin film. This Mandarin films is not uncommon at all. So it's very common actually to see subtitled films in 2 languages. So we'll see 2 different rows of subtitles in films, especially exhibited or distributed by the Shaw Brothers. Right? The importance of subtitles, of course, we all know today as well, cannot be overstated in reaching audiences across linguistic barriers. For example, an audience once wrote into a film magazine expressing that he or she dislikes Chinese films without English subtitles because the plots are so involved, especially in historical films, right? So I think we all have a sort of a common understanding how important subtitles are in bridging audiences across different linguistic barriers. But maybe here today, I want to focus on something that is more particular to early film culture. And by that, I mean promotional flyers. Right, so these are promotional flyers that were printed, designed, and made by film companies to publicize the films that they exhibit in their theater halls. Right, so this is so today I'm talking about Shaw, so I will be sharing all the materials that were being produced and distributed by Shaws. Right, in Chinese we call this flyers 戏桥. Okay, so 戏 literally means show or narrative or film, right? And then 桥 means bridge or connector. Okay, so literally, if you really just look at it, literally, 戏桥 or like these flyers serve to connect us to the film or to the film story. Okay, so I'll talk about the size of it first, right? Okay, so if we look at it this way, we can already see that it's actually quite large, and it is quite large. It is actually A3 in breadth. So if we have to keep it in an A3 folder today, we actually have to fold the little fold out on the right there, you see there, right? Before we are able to actually fit it into an A3 size folder. So it's even longer than an A3 size paper in totality, right? And what we see there on the right, I don't know if it's clear, but I will zoom in on this. It's actually the English synopsis of the film itself, right? And then on the flip side of it, we see the Malay synopsis of this Teochew film, Teochew opera film. Okay, so if we go back to look at the synopsis in English, right? What is interesting is this is, when I say synopsis, I actually really mean a very detailed write-up of the entire film narrative. So if we were to look at this example itself, okay, it begins by telling you the setting, where it happens. And then literally it tells you very clearly in 3-act narrative what happens in the film, right? In narrative-wise, all the way to the resolution of the narrative. So essentially by reading these flyers, you already know the entire story of the film, both in English and in Malay. I mean, on the main body itself is the Chinese language synopsis of the film. So what I find striking about this film culture, or this like tactic of producing such kinds of promotional flyers, right? I think two things can be said here. Firstly, it strikes me that space was specially being carved out, right, in reaching out to different linguistic communities, right? And we're talking about Teochew film here. It's really quite a minor cinema in the larger scheme of things, right? But even so, such effort and such resources were being, and labor, I would add, were being poured into promoting these films across different linguistic barriers, right? And this strikes me, it's already A3, and you created an extra fold out, to tell people about a story in English and Bahasa Melayu. Okay, so that's one thing that strikes me. And then the second thing that strikes me is we can truly see the viewing habit of audiences at that time, right? Spoilers were not a thing at all. Nobody cared about spoilers at that time, right? You can literally know the entire story before even stepping into the theater to watch the film. So relating this back to the first presenter's presentation on cinematic, Khan's presentation on cinematic language, I think what's interesting here is we can truly see how audiences went beyond narrative or went beyond language, to experience films across different linguistic barriers. And one facilitating medium is through such trilingual promotional flyers, right? So together with an insistence of subtitling, right, I would argue that this sort of trilingual promotional flyers enabled appreciation that transcends linguistic knowledge and linguistic barriers, right? And here I have more examples. So this is also still a Teochew opera film. And as we can see, it's really common to have such kind of large, long flyers, detailed flyers, right? Okay, and it's not just Teochew. We have like popular Mandarin opera films as well, okay, with equal effort being put in translation and in producing. And this is Mandarin modern films, as we call it. It's not an opera film, it's a modern narrative film, and it's the same, okay? It's also a modern narrative film. And at times we see also Jawi script being used instead of Rumi, because in the 50s and 60s, it was still very much a transitional period. So we can truly see so much effort and resources, talent being put into, translation and like producing trilingual promotional flyers, or CTL as we call it, right? Jawi script as well here. And just an interesting maybe anecdote to add. Okay, so all these film flyers, right, were printed and distributed in Singapore by the Shaw Brothers. But but we remember also that the Shaw Brothers operated as well in Malaya, right? So when these flyers are being sent to Malaya to be used in the Shaw Brothers theaters in Malaya, the cinemas there would roll over their own information onto these extra spaces, that were initially carved out for linguistic purposes. And I find this visually even more striking in terms of the interplay of languages on a single medium itself. But this is a topic for another day. Yeah, so we can see here, layovers, or print that is printed over again on the extra space that was being carved out. Right. And the second strategy I would add would be insertion and multiplication. And before I perhaps explain these terms, I would like to show you some examples first. So Movie News is a film magazine that the Shaws produced and distributed beginning 1948, right? As you can see from the movie magazine covers, it covers mostly Hollywood news, right? Or English-centric film-related news. Yet, when you really flip into this film magazines, it's really not uncommon to see reports about Malay cinema, Chinese cinema, of course, written in the English language. It's not uncommon to see full-page pictures of Malay film stars, right? Even juxtaposed side by side by Hollywood film stars. Malay film stars featuring on the film cover, on the magazine cover itself. And then in this particular issue, we see very clearly in the content page, Chinese and Malay films are being included in this English-centric film magazine. Sometimes we even have a full page of Malay film songs included in this magazine. So today we may take this for granted, Okay, given the availability of like what we call world cinema magazines and journals that are going on round and round today. But at that time, it was actually pretty unstraightforward for the Shaw brothers to do this. Okay, for example, we can see a reader who wrote into the film magazine to express displeasure because he or she does not agree with printing these photos, for this is an English movie news, not Malay, Chinese, or Indian. I advise readers who want film news other than English to buy books which have them, and please do not waste the pages of these unique magazines to print these stars photos, although no offense meant to anyone. Right? And so we see, if we were to, if we were to truly believe that this was, truly written by the public, right, then we can also see on the other hand that the demand was indeed very strong, right? We have many comments asking for, in this movie news magazine, asking for pictures of Malay actresses, right? News of Chinese, Malay, Hindustani films, Malay film stars, and even an entire comment written in Malay language, right? And in this comment, interestingly, the audience is asking if Shaw Brothers can produce a Malay language version of movie news as well, because he or she is sure that there is a demand and interest, sufficient interest for those who are interested and for those who like the Malay language throughout the Malay archipelago. Okay. Right, and of course, people are also supporting the film magazine, saying that expressing disapproval of the Malay pages, the Chinese film news, and the Malay film news by readers is unwarranted, and claiming that this is an English movie magazine is Tommy Rod. Okay, so this is really interesting. That's right, and a lot of them also express that this really beefs up the content of movie news magazine, right? And so this is what I mean by insertion or interruption and multiplication, right? And on the other hand, the Shaw brothers also produced Indian movie news beginning 1952, and one of the editors is a famous Tamil playwright today in Singapore as well. So Indian movie news, and in Indian movie news, what I find interesting is it's actually a bilingual issue. Right, so half of it is written in English, right? So this is also what I call insertion or multiplication in terms of Shaw's strategy in balancing multilingualism. And even up to 1980, we see in Indian Movie News magazine additional pages and pictorial contents in Bahasa Melayu. It says Bahasa Malaysia here. Okay, there's a whole section written in Malay, right, in Indian Malay News in 1980. And lastly, I would like to talk about specialization and compartmentalization. Okay, so I think audiences who have perhaps gone to cinemas or have been avid film goers at a time before cineplexes became a norm would be familiar with this phenomenon, right? Mainly in terms of distribution and exhibition strategies, when we have theaters that cater to specific kinds of films as defined by language. So for example, here we have Singapura Theatre, which will screen exclusively Hindustani, Tamil, and Malay pictures. This is another picture of it. And the Royal Theatre, which also screens mainly first-run Tamil films. Right? It was originally a Malay Bangsawan theatre. Okay, and we are familiar with this with this kind of distribution or specialization patterns when, for example, the Queen Cinema would be for Malay first-run films, the Capitol would be for English first-run films, the Oriental would be for Chinese first-run films, so on and so forth. So a specific theater would be tagged, to specific language kinds of films in terms of first run. Okay, a second run and a third run might be different, but audiences know where to go in general to get their appetite fed for different kinds of first run films as defined by language, right? And also for distribution strategy, so that was for exhibition, but in the Shaw's distribution strategy, we also see how the films were actually categorized in terms of language, right, more than anything else. So they provide films in these languages, right, rather than, for example, say genres or territories or nation states. It's by language. I mean, yeah, language and accents, right? So in closing, right, these are some of my observations about how the shows facilitated a multilingual film culture during a time when monolingual rather than multilingual films were the norm in Singapore and Malayan cinemas, at least in terms of production. Right? And to close, I would like to bring in an incident that happened closer to our times today. In 1994, a group of critics and intellectuals wrote an open letter to the Straits Times, urging for the establishment of a national body that could, among other aims, help to facilitate the dissemination of knowledge about our various cultures across linguistic and ethnic barriers, right? And that could facilitate informed cross-cultural exchange and interaction for our multicultural and multilingual society. This is a call that, in my opinion, remains relevant today, and is perhaps an issue that needs to be kept persistently in sight and in mind in our society, whether or not, or even if such a body comes to fruition. By bringing this up at the end of my sharing, I'm not suggesting here that the Shaw brothers could be seen as such a body. Either would be a gross overstatement, or that their processes of translation, insertion or multiplication, and compartmentalization or specialization should be emulated or be learned or repeated today. Indeed, whether or not their operations effectively facilitated translingual and cross-cultural understanding and communication is not exactly the same question as how they created a multilingual film culture and enterprise. And ultimately, we should also keep in mind that the Shaw's multilingual enterprise was primarily a profit-driven endeavor. However, I do think that what they did and how they facilitated how they functioned linguistically as a cultural institution with the resources to do so gives us a lot to think or reflect upon, right? Firstly, for example, their insistence and sustained investment in the work of translation in terms of not just subtitling, which also, by the way, involves usually 2 languages, and also in terms of print publications, particularly those intended for publicity like film promotional flyers, right? Carving out an extra space for that. And secondly, their apparent effort and inclination to constantly keep a host of different linguistic communities in mind, and a desire to reach out to them proactively, even though in their case, it was primarily out of expansionist capitalism, right? Thirdly, the fluidity in which they operated across perceived linguistic barriers, apparently unrestricted by ideas of linguistic purity and assumptions that link race or ethnicity to language. Right, so for example, having bilingual and trilingual publications, or for example, speaking about Malay cinema in Mandarin, Mandarin cinema in Malay, not assuming any disinterest or any interest across readers of their magazines, or including information about Malay cinema and Chinese language film magazines, or Malay film information in English-centric media, for example, right? And also lastly, I think one thing that can be further pondered upon would be the conceptual and material implications of spatial specialization or compartmentalization according to language. So I think these are issues that still remain pretty salient today, particularly in our commercial and mainstream film culture. And with that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you. Also, special thanks to Mr. Wong Han Min for all these valuable materials that I have shared with you today. Thank you.